Great. Okay, well, we will get started then. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Designing for People seminar series. My name is Jocelyn, and I'm the DFP research facilitator. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. As we've done for the past few seminars, I'd like to encourage those who are online today to participate by introducing yourselves in the chat and stating what native land you're joining us from. If you're not sure, you can use the link that Zara is dropping in the chat now. I'd like to acknowledge that DFP's offices and classrooms are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Traditional recognizes lands traditionally used and or occupied by the Musqueam people or other First Nations in other parts of the country. Ancestral recognizes lands that is handed down from generation to generation, and unceded refers to lands that was not turned over to the Crown or government by a treaty or other agreement. And before we get started, I have a couple of announcements. So the first one is very exciting. Our annual design showcase is scheduled for May 16th to 18th. This year, we're thrilled to announce that we're hosting the event on GatherTown, a popular web conferencing software program. So graduate students who are doing any design-related research are invited to submit a poster or demo to the showcase. If you'd like to participate, please submit a notice of intent by April 6th. Zara will drop a link in the showcase or in the chat box for you now. We're also looking for event sponsors and have new and upgraded sponsorship packages. So if you're interested in sponsoring or know of someone who might be interested in sponsoring, please reach out. The next announcement is specifically for students. We now have a DFP student Slack channel. So this is where you can ask all of your DFP related questions. We'll also be sharing announcements and job opportunities there. Next, we are excited to share that we have a new Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force, which we're calling the DFP Jedi Task Force, led by DFP faculty Nazdan Virji-Babel and Julia Ballard. They'd like to remind students to please take a few minutes to fill out our anonymous demographic survey so that they can collect the data they need to review our student composition and implement policy and procedure changes to improve the diversity and inclusion at DFP. Lastly, we have our final seminar of the term on April 13th with DFP nursing faculty Lillian Hung and Kristen Haas, titled, Does Technology Replace Human Care? And with that, I'm going to pass things over to our seminar steering committee chair, Don Lukian.
Hello, I'm happy to introduce Sowmya, Professor Sowmya Somanath here. Sowmya is an assistant professor in the computer science at University of Victoria. She joined UVic in 2020, so she has spent about 2 years there under pandemic, but now she's coming out to the real world.
Yes.
Welcome. Sowmya was an assistant professor at OCAD, Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto for 2 years before that. So she's doing a deep design research in HCI in that context, and now she's joining the technicality in her research at computer science at UVic. She completed her PhD from the University of Calgary in 2017, and at UVic, she leads the Creative Experience Lab. What they do? They study people creating digital and physical artifacts using technology. So you can kind of picture 3D printers, digital sewing machine, electronics, and many DIY projects. So she's working on applications for education, health monitoring, thinking about glucose monitors and home context. And she built tools for helping people doing that, and also try to understand process and value in such creative endeavor. She also co-leads VIXI lab at UVic in computer sciences, co-led by 3 faculty there. VIXI focuses on topics on the human-computer interaction and InfoVis. It's composed of students and advisors, Sowmya, Charles Perrin, and Miguel Nascenta. I'm happy to conclude the invitation of the entire VIXI faculty with Sowmya being here, meaning we had Charles and Miguel visit here in past 2 years. One congratulatory note is that VIXI group got CFI grant approved. So they're gonna build an exciting living lab where people are gonna build and create such artifacts using digital fabrication. So really excited to hear about today's talk about part of such endeavor. Also, Sowmya works on the other topics related to new physical interactions, such as autonomous vehicle, wearable cyborg limbs, and augmented and virtual reality. Right. So the show is on your own. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that wonderful introduction. Folks on Zoom, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Actually. Oh, thanks. So thank you for that invitation and also for the introduction. I'm happy to finally be able to see some folks in person and actually leave home and be in the university. So it's exciting. So as John mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the computer science department at the University of Victoria. And the talk that I'm giving today is titled Designing Physical Interactions. Before I get into what the topic is, I want to show you a little bit about where I'm coming from and who I am as a researcher. Let's see. Okay. So as Donald was saying, about 2 years now, we started a human-computer interaction and visualization lab at the University of Victoria, and it's called VIXI. And it's co-led by Charles Perrin, the person with the blue arrow, and Miguel Nacenta, the person with the yellow arrow, and myself. And that's some of our students looking happy. There are more people since we've taken this photograph, and there's also a person on Zoom. So that's the lab space, and there's a lot of new folks who are coming in and are helping us to get the lab going and getting some excited projects going. Before moving to UVic, I did 2 years of assistant professor position at OCAD, which is a art and design university in Toronto. And there too, I had the opportunity to work with some amazing students and collaborators. And it's all of these folks who really make a lot of the research possible and bring it to life. So there's a lot of thanks to them. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And as for who I am as a researcher, so my background is computer science. That's what I got my degrees in. And in terms of research, I do human-computer interaction research. And as some of you might know, human-computer interaction research area is pretty broad. It has a lot of different focus areas. And so within that space, I sort of look at one focus area which relates to physical interactions of people with other people, people with objects, devices, with non-humans, so things like pets, robots, and agents. And in that sort of space, I look at how to leverage and extend the richness and situatedness of all these physical interactions. So this looks at the kinds of social meanings that we derive from these interactions, the purpose that we get from interacting with objects or creating things or with people. It looks at the emotional connections we build through these interactions, as well as sort of the cognitive and perceptive abilities we gain from it. So I try to sort of leverage and extend those, and I do that by creating new interactive experiences. And I created these new interactive experiences to, at present, sort of support 2 high-level tasks. One related to engaging people in creative activities like making of physical, tangible objects themselves, and also sort of supporting people's interaction with the physical embodiments of technology in an everyday context. So how do you interact with a vehicle on the street as a pedestrian, or how do you interact with your Roomba at home? So I kind of also look at those kinds of things. Most of the times, these tasks kind of overlap, and that's largely because sort of creativity has a spectrum. On one end, there is sort of the big C, which is all the professional kind of content that people can create, gets recognized by societies and communities. So think of like an academic publication. So we can build tools to support such professionals. And on the other end, there's also everyday creativity. That is things we do in our everyday lives. So creative problem solving, making art and craft, repairing things in your home, or repurposing things in your home. So and we can build tools to support that sort of everyday creativity as well. And much of the work that I've been doing so far sort of is in that side of things that is supporting everyday creativity. The reason I do this is sort of twofold. One, it's almost sort of like a silly sounding but pragmatic reason, that is, we exist in the physical world and there's really no escaping that. So I'm interested in thinking about how to make that a better experience, more broadly accessible, how to make it more efficient, engaging, interactive, and fun. And the second reason I do this is mostly personal. That is, I like to make things myself. So I like knitting, I like sewing. I'll build some tangible stuff for myself, like the email notification device picture that you see there. And so I like to think about, okay, how do we go about doing these kinds of activities? Where might technology support us? What kinds of challenges do people face? What are their strategies? And I try to learn from that and then sort of engage that in my own research. Sorry. Okay, so in my research group, these are some of the keywords that our projects sort of fit within: the human-computer interaction, which is sort of the broadest umbrella term. Then there's physical and tangible user interfaces, tools for making, human-robot interaction, and more recently, some accessibility work as well. And these are some of the keywords that get associated with the projects that we do. And at a research question level, these are some of the questions I've been mostly asking so far. While they're not necessarily explicit and independent of each other, they provide a little bit of an overview of how the projects cluster and work. So the first one is thinking about why, how, and what do people create with technology. And usually in these projects, the things that people are creating are tangible, physical, interactive devices and systems. So that's kind of some pictures just to give you a little bit of a glimpse of what that looks like. And the second question is, in order to make things, or even otherwise, how do people communicate with the physical embodiments of the technology so that it supports them in their everyday interactions? And that's kind of some of their projects. So you'll see robots, you'll see autonomous vehicles, you'll see other kinds of things. And another sort of question I ask in the group is, how do we sort of transition into and out of these physical experiences? And this comes from, the fact that everything is almost like a routine. Like, think about when you drive a car, you come out of a pedestrian mode and you get into a driver mode, and there's a transition that you do both physically and cognitively. You wear a seatbelt and you get into that mode. So the same way for these kinds of tasks of like, how do you make or how do you interact? And so thinking about how do you transition into and out of these kinds of experiences is also something I look at. And so that's roughly some of those projects of things like, what would it mean to become a cyborg, and so forth. So for the interest of time, I won't get in. I'll mostly show you some projects from the first question and one from the second, and I won't really get into the third, but I'm happy to chat more about it if you're interested. And also, I won't get into the details of how the projects were implemented and all of the results. I mostly want to use this as a way to give you an overview of the kinds of stuff I do. And if anything piques your interest, then I'm happy to discuss further and keep chatting. So yes, let's get started. So this is sort of the first question of why, how, and what do people create using technologies? And my foray into this sort of space started when I was sort of finishing my master's program and was going to start my PhD. And it kind of came from reading papers like this. So papers that were looking at sustainable making, tangible user interfaces, crafting technologies, lily pads, and so on and so forth. So I was reading some of this work, and that's kind of what led me to think about wanting to do more work in this space. And as I was reading a lot of this work, there were two things that kind of stood out to me. One was a lot of the studies were sort of done from a Western perspective. And so usually, I don't know, there was a little bit of an assumption that things were available, people were enthusiastic, wanted to do it, and so on and so forth, or at least it was somewhat part of the discourse. And the other thing I noted was that not necessarily in these papers, but in some others, there was a lot of optimism in that, making is absolutely exciting. It's the thing we should all be doing. We all are makers and all of that sort of work. And as someone who was making things and never really called myself a maker, I thought, well, there must be others like me who must be finding this difficult. Like, I enjoy it, but it's not easy. It's not like I get into it and I'm like, yay, this is so great. So I kind of thought, okay, well, there must be other challenges. So I wanted to understand what they were and see if there was technology that could help with those kinds of things. And I did some studies in sort of trying to understand that. And so the title of all of these studies, I call it Making Within Constraints. And these constraints sort of exist, and I wanted to sort of mostly bring them to the forefront. It's not that, they were new constraints, they've always existed, but I wanted to sort of bring them to the forefront and think about what it looked like and think about tools. So I did some studies in India and I did some studies in Canada, and I worked for these particular studies, I worked with high school students in sort of informal learning environments and looking at what would they make with programmable electronics like Arduinos, LilyPads, etc. And how does that help them? So, or what do they want to do with making? And some things we learned was, they were making because it helped them express themselves. They were making because it helped them learn science concepts in a different way. And so I wanted to understand how they went about that process. And part of the qualitative study that I did at these places led to identifying some challenges and led to identifying some strategies. And I was very particular that I also wanted to understand the strategies, largely because I think sometimes when we do research, we go in with the mindset of only finding a problem so that we can address it. Whereas, people, especially people who make things, have more or less sometimes found a workaround, even if there's a problem. So I wanted to understand what those workarounds were, what those strategies were, so that we could incorporate them into the tools we develop, as opposed to create like a brand new solution that they would have to now learn or integrate into their workflow. So these are some, and I won't explain all of these. These are some corresponding papers that help provide some background on all of this. But I will show you a few projects from here on that try to, highlight how some of this could be tackled using user interfaces. So the one I want to show is about making despite material constraints. So in theory, or in the ideal world, when you start to make something with, say, programmable electronics and art and craft materials or whatever, you want to be in a place like this. You want to be in the Shenzhen market, which has relatively abundant supply of stuff and things are available and you can dream it and it's kind of there. It's like a magical land of electronics. But the reality is more like this at best. You have some materials. Even this is almost, like a nice to have environment where you have multiple kits and you have materials. The closer reality is usually you have one kit and you don't have all the components. And what happens is that when you get it, you're so excited and you're like, oh, I'll build this cool thing. And then you're like, oh, but I don't have that component and I don't have another component and I don't have something else. And so either I'll drop that project or I have to rethink it, or it goes on a pause and then I may or may not come back to it. So, and this was true of what happened in our studies as well. We saw this happen in our studies as well. But the cool thing was that these students, when they wanted to make something, they didn't really stop. They found a workaround. They found a way to, create hacky versions of it. So there was an example where a student needed some specific resistors and we hadn't provided them. So they took this metal wire and they found like a thick and a thin metal wire and they sort of substituted the metal wire. And yes, it's not a perfect solution, but it kind of works enough to keep going to a point, where you can at least try out a bunch of ideas before you have to commit to pay to buy new material. So that's kind of what we wanted to sort of leverage and build on. And so we try to build a prototyping tool that addresses this concern. And Ultimately, you do need the materials if you want to build a physical interactive system, but before you get there, you still usually can do a lot of prototyping without necessarily having everything at hand. So we looked at sort of a hybrid prototyping approach, and that's the tool I want to show you next. So the idea is you build with whatever you have at hand, and what you don't have, you simulate using augmented reality. And so in this case, there's an object called polymorphic cube, which is essentially a QR code. And this polymorphic cube has a footprint of an LED in that, it acts, the microcontroller thinks this is an LED, and so it recognizes it. But from a program standpoint, it can be anything. It can be a servo, it can be an LED, it can be a button, it can be anything you want. And once your Arduino recognizes that these are the components in your circuit, you can program it, and then you're able to interact with whatever you don't have using augmented reality to control the physical, and you can do vice versa as well. So you can have output there and input here, and so on and so forth. So this is some work that we did, and then we wanted to see if it makes sense. So we did some studies on this too. And what we learned was that this was a good way for people to get into what is called implementation tinkering. That is, they could try out code, they could reach a point that they were happy with what they were programming, so they would be ready with the code when the components arrived. But in theory, you can also do that using a virtual simulator. So you can have a online simulator where you don't have to buy any component, and you can simulate everything and have all the code written. So this isn't necessarily like a major benefit that you get from hybrid prototyping. These are the two that somewhat more highlight why it's important to do hybrid prototyping. So the other one is design tinkering. So when you make physical things, and if you've made like art and craft projects, you'll remember how particular you were about how things look, how it's shaped, where it goes on the wall of my house, or it goes on my table and it occupies a specific space, and so on and so forth. That's hard to do when you're doing things digitally. So digitally, you can simulate a circuit, but you still would have to prototype the physical thing in paper or something and imagine those two fitting together. Whereas with this one, you have a little bit more opportunity to start to already put your pieces wherever they're supposed to go. They may not be perfect, but at least you have an approximation and you see everything play out in that physical space. So that was sort of a benefit that we were hearing, that it gave people an opportunity to do design tinkering. And this is something that we weren't necessarily aiming for, but it came out of the study, was that a lot of our participants spoke about how this created a somewhat easier shareable resource. So unlike having to email code or start to email circuits, here you could have stuff on a QR code and you could share it with your friend in a classroom, or you could lend it to your partner who's working with you on a group project, and they could keep building on it. And you could put components on a QR code, you could put components and code on a QR code, and you could share it, and they could plug it into their circuit and start remixing and trying. So those are some things that we learned. And I definitely do want to keep thinking more about this going forward once I can find a student who's interested. So from here, I want to sort of switch to a different project. And this is about making, but making at a makerspace. So a makerspace is essentially a community space where people can go and build stuff using the community's tools. And makerspaces sort of came up with the fact that, we all cannot buy all the equipment in the world, and it kind of makes sense. We don't want to buy everything. So you could go to a community and use shared resources. And it also came from the fact that when you go to these community spaces, you get a chance to work with other people. And so you learn from them, you share, you discuss, and so on and so forth. But when you're a new person and say the first time you get a membership and you want to go, it can be a little bit intimidating to go to maker spaces. And sometimes there are other kinds of things, like they can be quite gendered and all sorts of things that make the entry process into a maker space a little bit complex when you're completely brand new. But even before the more complex questions around how gendered these can be and all of that, there are some basic questions that we found that novices ask, and other research had also pointed to that. That is, you go into a makerspace, you say, I want to build this project, and you're saying, okay, which tools can I use? Where is that tool? Which station is it on? If my project has 5 steps, do I have to do all of the 5 in a sequential order, or can I branch? And that's sort of the information that sometimes novices struggle with. And we were thinking that the physical space could provide some of that guidance and navigate this person through their project making process, and we could leverage the physical space. So we did this project called MakeAware, and I'll show you a video of what this looks like.
As maker communities are growing, more novices are entering maker spaces. They may not have the knowledge to recognize objects in the environment, understand complex digital fabrication tools, or accurately predict the outcome of their actions. Situation awareness is the perception of environmental elements and events, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their future status. To scaffold novices' situation awareness within a makerspace, we developed MakeAware, a digital guidance system comprised of both software and hardware features. MakeAware is designed to help novices perceive and comprehend how the environment is relevant to their project. When the maker chooses a task to complete, the state beacon at the recommended location turns blue. To help makers perceive and comprehend other makers in the space and their usage of the tools, we embed sensors in the environment and use colored lighting to indicate the status of the station. A tablet interface also conveys information to scaffold situation awareness. An overview panel helps them to project their ideas into the future by visualizing the end result and how they may achieve it. The project map shows the steps of the project as branches that need to be completed before the final step, to help makers comprehend how their tasks fit into the project and to project what future states of the project will look like by peeking at tasks. It also helps them to perceive and comprehend their possible options. Selecting a task produces the instruction panel. The minimap provides comprehension and projection support. A metadata card provides details about the task, and the image shows the intended results of the step. These features aim to support comprehension and projection by giving makers the means to form accurate expectations. A video playlist is included to support novices who lack previous knowledge. We evaluated MakeAware with 12 novice makers building a set of bookends. Overall, participants rated the situation awareness support system as being more useful than some other common methods.
So stop here, and hopefully you got a little bit of a sense of what the system does, but essentially it helps people figure out how they can build a project by giving them environmental cues, giving them cues about the tools, as well as giving them information on this tablet, which allowed sort of breakdown of tasks and so on and so forth. Sort of shifting gears here, we've also been thinking about how makers share insights. So not just how do you approach making, but once you do build something, how do you share some of that process with others? And this is a large part of the maker community. So a lot of people join these maker communities because they want to be able to share what they learn. They believe in this idea of free ideas. That is, they can openly share, openly learn. And that is sort of a large draw for many people to become part of these communities. And so we were wondering, how do people share insights? And traditionally, this happens through some form of documentation that gets posted on a website like Instructables, if you've seen it, or Thingiverse. And other times, they're like rarely, but it happens, there will be like a magazine or a printout, like a manual of sorts. So think of like IKEA manuals when you have to build your furniture, for example. So one of the challenges though with that kind of sharing is that it's like you write it once or you print it once and that's sort of where it stops. But what happens is when we make something or we put it out in the world, and then we sort of get to think more about it, and so our design decisions or reflections on it might be different, and it's kind of difficult to keep sharing or keep that conversation going. And a parallel to that can be like if when you write research papers and you read it, I don't know, 3 years later, you're like, oh, I could have written that so much better, or I could have framed that so much better, or whatever, right? So it's sort of a similar sort of problem, not the same, but somewhat similar. So we were wondering as to how to then make that sort of possible. And so the approach was to create this sort of soft documentation of sorts where information could be provided, but it could also sort of be updated over time. And we wanted to create these information-rich objects that would embed all these details and could go out in the world so people could learn about them, but also the makers could keep updating information if they wanted to. So we did this for 3D printing, and we looked at how, as you're 3D printing something, you can embed information about why you're making it, what you're making, any specific information about the model. And so we looked at strategies like spatial association, looked at how would you organize information, what kind of structure does a document have if it exists on a physical object, and so on and so forth. But I'll show you a video of what this system at a high level looks like. Sorry. So that was sort of the process. Essentially, you have tags that you could associate information to, then you can embed those tags and you 3D print with the tags, and you have an interface for associating information, editing information, and for retrieving information. That's at a high level what it does. And again, we have some studies looking at if this is meaningful, how would people use it, and also some sort of speculative future scenarios for these kinds of tools. And some of the ones that we identified were looking at things like in education, where say a teacher wants to explain some of these concepts, and sometimes difficult to explain using a picture only. So if I say, oh, look at the printing technique on this, and sometimes you need to feel it. And so it's easier to sort of give these objects with information out that people could retrieve information from, and so on and so forth. And the other way to do this is to even just have your own documentation that exists and sort of reflect on it over time so that you can make changes and things like that. So that's some work that we did with how makers share insights. And from here, I want to kind of sort of jump to a different research question, but it still relates to creating. And it's about how do these devices communicate with us, and perhaps even with each other, and how do they sort of support creative activities. And so this is a project that's currently under submission, so I won't get into a lot of details on it, but this is some work we are doing in collaboration with SFU, so Ron Vakari's group. And it's trying to understand if we might be able to identify new forms of human-machine collaboration in the context of digital fabrication. And it builds on a philosophy concept called composite intentionality. So it's this concept which posits that just as we humans sort of direct ourselves in the world and have an intentionality, machines and technologies can do the same. And composite intentionality is about combining these two intentionalities to create a form of interaction. So an example of this is, think of a microphone. placed in a room. And if a lot of people are talking, at some point we as people sort of filter out the other people's conversation and really just focus on the few people around us. Whereas your microphone sort of captures all of the noise. And so that's sort of the machine's intentionality. That is, it has this ability to capture everything that we as people might not be able to do ourselves. And so the idea is that by combining the human intentionality and the machine's intentionality, we might be able to create new forms of interaction. So we've been thinking about something like that in the context of fabrication. And so we ran this sort of about 2 month long study where we invited people who had experience with 3D printing to try out 4 printers that we had made and print with them and tell us what they think about that sort of collaboration that emerges. And these machines had somewhat exaggerated technological intentionalities. So basically we had a machine that could alter its hardware, so the fan speed, the speed at which the 3D printing happens, so that the print could look slightly different. A 3D printer that could leverage its ability to connect to network, so access data on the network. And also a 3D printer that, if you think about how 3D printing services work, it sort of fits in this workflow where you receive a print, the machine prints it, and then the print gets sent to the person who wanted it. So it's sort of part of this assembly line. And so we were also thinking about a printer that could leverage this sort of knowing in the position that it exists, it could sort of shrink a print or expand a print based on the parcel sizes that the print shop had available. So in some ways, these are somewhat funny instances where, you know, like the printer sort of starts almost starting to degrade the print. So that's kind of the topmost left image that you see where the quality of the print kind of looks poor. And it's happened because the printer sort of reduces the amount of filament that it was extruding. This one where it started to shrink because it thought that the only parcel box it has is a small box. So it's like, I'll still give you the print that you asked for, but I'll just like squish it. So it's sort of somewhat fun. It's somewhat on a more humorous side, but through this approach, we were able to ask sort of what if questions. So by sort of showing a somewhat absurd interaction, we're at least able to start a conversation around what if machines had explicit intentionality. And this method is called material speculation. And as such, if you believe in this sort of philosophical concept, or at least agree with it, then the idea is that technological intentionality always exists. It's just that we don't necessarily leverage it. And so this idea was to exaggerate it and to see if people would like to sort of take a look at it. So what came out of this sort of study so these makers printed 2 rounds with the printer of their choice, and they would reflect on it, stay with the prints for a few days and have a conversation with us and then print again. So it kind of happened over roughly 2 months. And what we learned from this was that this interaction opened up a space of anticipation. So if you think about, say, human-human collaboration, it's the same, right? Like when you collaborate with a person, there's a certain sense of anticipation of, will this collaboration be exciting? Will it be fun? I don't know, maybe I'll be disappointed, maybe I'll be frustrated. And there's all this anticipation, but then you still collaborate because you think having more people will usually lead to new ideas or better ideas, or maybe something that you didn't think about. So it's the same here. So sometimes people will be very frustrated. It's like, oh, why did this print get shrunk? And that's not what I wanted. So sometimes they were mad at the printer. But other times they were kind of happily surprised. So, you know, although the degrading quality was not something the person wanted, they thought it was a really nice output because the data that they wanted to show was sort of wildfires. And so the degrading effect helped them sort of add a layer of design that they hadn't necessarily considered when they were modeling it. So it was a sort of a happy surprise, and it helped them in some ways improve the model. So that's kind of what we've been thinking about, of like how if explicit intentionalities could be exposed, whether the nicer ones or, you know, the not so nice ones perhaps, what would happen is that we could have these collaborations with machines where the outputs could look different. So that's sort of where we are at with this one. So that's all the stuff we've done so far. And so from here to for another couple of minutes, I want to sort of skip forward and show you what we're working on right now. And much of this is pretty open-ended. So I definitely don't have answers to a lot of questions on these projects, but I'd love to discuss them. So a question that I'm sort of thinking more and more about more recently is, what can people build or make? What could they make, or what do they make? And how might they use these things that they make? And this sort of, again, stems from my own personal experience of like building stuff and then not using it. I feel I've put all this energy and effort in it that I need to protect it forever. And so there's never a time that I feel like I need to use it. And so I've been thinking more and more about what happens when we make things. Do we use them, or does it just, add to the stuff in your home? And that's sort of at least my personal thought behind it, but I'm also generally interested in understanding what is it that people make for everyday life and how do they use it. So one of the projects we've been looking at is sort of biomedical engineering side of things. So looking at how people might not necessarily build, but maybe modify or customize or personalize assistive technology. So these are healthcare products that they use in their day-to-day life. And this is a project that we started recently with a grant from NRC, so some of these folks, and also collaboration with Autodesk Research. And we've been thinking about whether people would like to, personalize devices like their glucose monitors, which they have to use on a regular basis. And the motivation for this came from the fact that some of these groups of people already do make things for themselves. So actually folks who have diabetes have a very active making or maker community. So there's something called Night Scouts. A lot of, if you Google stuff on Pinterest, you'll find a lot of like storage containers and those kinds of things that people make. They make sort of accessories for their monitors. They will try to, decorate it so that it reflects their personalities. So it's sort of motivation came from that. And also we did some preliminary work for this by Arman before these folks got involved. And his brother had type 1 diabetes, and he really wanted to think of how his brother would start using his monitor because he thought it was kind of ugly and would sometimes leave it, which was dangerous. So that's kind of how we even sort of got into it. And so we did some early co-design studies, some preliminary co-design studies where we worked with people who have type 1 diabetes and use glucose monitors in their day-to-day life. And we asked them to sort of sketch or prototype physical things to show us what they envision a glucose monitor should look like and how it might function. And they had already used a range, most of them had used a range of monitors that were commercially available. So they had some experience that they could build off of. So these are some examples. So people were talking about things that got integrated into clothes, things that maybe got integrated into your teeth, things that could go on your ears, or it could be like jewelry, like a necklace and things like that. We also asked them questions around whether they would like to build these things themselves or whether they wanted something that was made and they could sort of buy off the shelf. And so what we learned was that there was a range here. So people wanted to personalize it for many different reasons. So they wanted something that would better match their lifestyle. So if I do a lot of sports, it's usually not ideal to have a very bulky device that might hit into me. Or people wanted something that would match a context. So if they were going to be in an office meeting, they didn't want their glucose monitor beeping very loudly. So they wanted other kinds of feedback mechanism, like maybe buzz or a visual display. So people wanted to sort of personalize different things, but also their approach to personalization had a range. So there were some who wanted to be able to buy this off the shelf, some who wanted to make modifications, but they sort of envisioned they would make it once or twice and have these two versions, and that's kind of it. And then there were the more enthusiastic folks who wanted to build very often and keep changing and have lots of versions and sort of extend it. And when you have a range like that, and when you're sort of designing for one size fits one, it's pretty tricky because you have a lot of needs that you have to take into consideration. So we tried to think of one way to do it, and we tried to build a very early prototype to see if it would make sense or not. And this is called DiaFit, and Arman sort of was inspired by Fitbit-like designs, and so he built an early version of it. So basically you get these components which you can wear as a wristwatch, as a necklace, as a piece that goes on your ear, and to that you can stick on these modular feedback mechanisms. So you can have a visual display, you can have an auditory feedback mechanism, or you can have like a vibration sensor so it buzzes. And people could use pre-programmed modules, or they could try to program them. And clearly this is a little bit sort of ugly. It's a prototype, it's not pretty. So we didn't expect people will be wearing this right away and going out. But it was mostly to show what it could look like. And so we did some more interviews after this. And again, we heard, some people who were happy to be doing this, some people less enthusiastic, or like they were like, I just want one thing pre-built and that's all I want. And some who were happy to modify to some extent, but not go all the way of like programming and things like that. So now we're sort of building on this work. And one thing we realized is that, okay, let's say people build all this stuff. There's still the challenge of, okay, is it going to be safe? Like, let's say I built something and I didn't incorporate the right level of feedback sensors and I'm not able to monitor my glucose correctly. Is that safe? So one thing we are starting to now look at is this collaborative design, where we work with not just the end user, but also with the health professionals. So someone like a diabetes educator or a dietitian who they go to regularly, and also a product designer to see if these three stakeholders can sort of together create designs that are safe and meet the user needs, and then the user can go off and build it, or it can be built on a service and they can get it, for example. So that's the work we're doing now, and we'll start running some early workshops along these lines. The other sort of project that we're working on also looks at personalization of wearables, but this time mostly related to clothing. And this comes from the idea that, we have a lot of clothes, and if you can make a lot of clothes, but how do you sort of keep them going for long rather than discarding them for things like fast fashion and all of that stuff. So we were thinking about, okay, what if maybe, it had more functionality than simply a piece of clothing? So we were thinking about storytelling. So I'm going to wrap up very fast from here. I'm almost at the tail end. So we know clothes already tell stories, and fashion designers like Yolanda Skelton, who we were able to interview. She's a local BC designer. She creates these urban clothes which tell indigenous stories. And so clothes already do this. They tell stories. They say something about the person. They mark time. They have all this functionality already. So we're thinking about, okay, maybe then we make some of this more explicit. Can we allow home stores as a starting point to start to incorporate more stories and make it explicit, and see if that would, add more functionality and more use for the clothes and accessories that we have. So we created some examples. So Sabrina is the student who's working on it, and this is the dress that she made to tell the story of her moving from Alberta to Victoria when she came as a PhD student. And we learned that it could include fabric types, sewing styles, colors, patterns, etc. And we also are collecting some sketches from home stores, and we learned that electronics could be part of it. It can be dynamic. The challenge, though, is how do you make it not look like a Christmas sweater, because those are things that people are not so happy to be wearing every day. So we've been thinking about all of these things and thinking about, okay, what does a toolkit for storytelling look like? How do you take a storyboard and map it to these different elements? How do you still make it nice looking? And how do you make it possible? So that's another project. And in 1 minute, I will quickly tell you a little bit about another work we're doing, which looks at how people might be building data representations in physical format for themselves. So in home context, for like decision making as a family, but also for motivation. So, like this chair that might not allow you to sit if you didn't exercise or things like that. So looking at how your home responds to you, how you can represent data in your everyday built environments and everyday objects, and look at how that helps you. So that's another work that we're looking at. So with all of this, I'm going to sort of try to wrap up. And so why do I do all of this? I told you part of it is personal and part of it is because, we exist in this physical world. But my ultimate hope and goal is that I will hopefully be able to sort of contribute to expanding the toolbox to help people, to be able to make to learn things and learn from making things. And that's a little bit of a loaded impact statement, but I'll leave it at that and say thank you for this opportunity and sort of take this time to say, hey, come visit us at UVic. We're not that far. So thank you.
Thank you, Sowmya. Great. So quick Q&A time for about 8 minutes. We can take 3-4 questions. I would like to prioritize the question from people here in person because they have paid a precious visit, and also especially students members. And then we're gonna move on to online and faculty members. I hope that's fair. So any questions, people?
Should I stop sharing so people can see the Zoom screen, or what do you prefer?
Yeah, there'll be, yeah, good.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Online participant can raise their hand if you have a question. Then we can open the question session to everybody. Oh, yeah, Hania, go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah, I thought, thank you for your talk today, by the way. I thought that your insight about being inherently optimistic was something I never really heard before. And I was wondering how you could use that conclusion that guided a lot of your other makerspace research.
So,
Can you repeat?
oh yes, sorry.
For online.
Okay, yeah, actually, yeah. And I'll also see if I got the question right by repeating it. So my understanding is you're asking, how did I sort of reach the initial point of looking at the constraints in making and sort of tackle the opposite view of that making might not be as fun and as optimistic as one envisions? Is that sort of the question? Yeah. Okay. So part of that answer is that there was literature when I was starting this research. There was a few papers that were talking about these kinds of constraints, especially from the Asian context, looking at how they were doing this not necessarily for self-expression, but for livelihood reasons. And there were challenges in that process. And there were one or two that were talking about sort of gendered constraints. So the lily pad was a paper that was talking quite a lot about how making was sort of considered a very male-centric sort of activity that left out other genders from participation. So there were some initial papers that sort of were there. And after that, I had the, before I got into the research, my supervisor was kind enough to give me a lot of electronics so I could build stuff myself and see. So I spent some time building a few mini projects to get a sense of what is involved. And then I had a bit of a hunch that this is where I anticipate things, like there might be gaps and problems, and then sort of did an early study to see if that would be true.
Thank you. Any further question? Well, I have a sort of generic question, which is about what's the magical quality of this physical interaction you think that this digital fabrication enables? So definitely, there might be something about being more authentic, unique, or being on my own body. But you have a deeper experience on this domain. So what do you think it makes authentic and meaningful for people?
That's a really good question, and a little bit hard, I think, because it's so individual, like everyone feels differently. But at least what I found is that I think what makes this process sort of rich experience is that we build emotional connections with the things that we create. Like, you'll build it and you say, I'll give it as a gift, and you do it with a lot of love and you put a lot of labor. Or you'll build something and say, or especially when you've thought a lot about things like painting and stuff like that, it usually represents, or it's almost an extension of this person who created it. And so there's that sort of emotional quality attached to this. And I find that it happens more so in sort of digital, in physical building than in digital content. I think sometimes what happens in digital content is that you focus so much on the tools of how to create that it sort of takes away from, does this still represent me, or is this an emotional thing? Whereas with materials, I think the fact that you touch them, you mold them, you build them, you leave them there, you come back, and it sort of exists in your space more so than a digital app, for example, would exist. Like, it exists on your phone, but you only see it when it's there. But when you build something physical, it's kind of always there, and you see it, and you know that you can keep reflecting that you put this kind of time and effort into it. I think that's sort of what builds a little bit of that strong connection with these objects, and therefore, we think that, okay, people might want to keep it longer. People think it means something more than a digital entity. But yeah, I think it kind of varies, but I think that's what personally I think makes it somewhat unique compared to a digital artifact, a pure digital artifact.
Yeah, the point about emotional relationship to artifact is something that I can definitely relate. And maybe that tells that these supporting tools shouldn't focus on the efficiency or performance, making it easy, but to more about this meaningful relationship with the object. Because when I put a lot of effort to do something, I feel more attached to it. So making it easy wouldn't make it more meaningful or important.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, like, personally, I feel the same. And that's kind of how, like, if you compare programming, you still create something when you program, right? But you put so much effort in, like, okay, what is my programming language? Is my syntax right? Is my logic right? Is a pointer pointing to, I don't know, some null array somewhere? You spend so much time and energy thinking about the syntax and sort of the technical aspects of it that sometimes you focus less on what you eventually created. And what you, I think, take away is the effort you took in writing that code, that is the lines of code and all of that. And you kind of leave the end product out. Whereas with this one, I think the end product's usually almost always there in front of you. And so you're able to reflect on it, and you kind of end up creating more relationships with the object that you created. And sort of the process is helpful in reflecting on that, I think.
Wow. Yeah, that's groundbreaking for that's great answer. Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah. Any other question? I think we can take one question maybe. If not, I think we can gladly claim victory for this session. And thank you again for an awesome talking Q&A session, Sowmya.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for coming.
And everyone who's online.